Yeah, all right. So thank you so much for this informative presentation. I really enjoy every part. So my question is if you can elaborate on the nexus between biopolitics, tourism, and disciplinarian of refugees and migrant studies. And now many discussions have been focusing on the triangle of biopolitics, tourism, and biopower implication over the bodies of indigenous people. But I think the same triangle with the focus on the rising of immigrants and refugees as a labor force deserve also our critical attention. Specifically now within the recent years, states are using migrants and refugees to capitalize their economic benefits. And among them is the tourism as an industry, right? So let me just give a context of the question, let's say. Now in Jordan, we have within the tourism, let's say, industry, we have two categories of labor. We have the Jordanian, which usually are hired as the expert, hence their wages is totally different. And then we have the migrants and refugees, whether we're talking about Syrian refugees or talking about migrants coming from Egypt, or Southeast Asia, like Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Philippines, right? So on the one hand, the Jordanian indigenous are, of course, perceived as the skilled and expert. And then there is the others who are subjugated to various forms of racism and inequalities, whether we're talking about wages, short-term contracts. This is from one angle. The other one is the other, let's say, layer is the foreign tourists who come or who travel for pleasure versus the migrant who is constantly under the threat of either deportation or violence. So where do you stand on this nexus, let's say? Thank you so much.
Well, where I stand on this next.
Oh. Sorry for interrupting you, but I think it helps if we get some questions all together, and you can answer them in a cluster. That's why I asked perhaps Marta and Mira can perhaps share with us, and Delia, their own questions. Sorry for clustering things together, but I think it helps. It helps in terms of time, and it will help you actually answer. Otherwise, you'll be bombarded with this.
Yeah, definitely, and it's allow for more people to ask questions, and then we can. Yeah. Okay.
I can go if it's fine for you.
Go ahead, Marta. Let's try to be concise on that. Yes?
Perfect. Yeah. So my question is actually, thank you so much. That was very, very interesting. So thank you. And my question is kind of easy and straightforward. This is very interesting. And this is a very interesting, theoretical, framework. And I would love to know if you have some suggestion for the researcher who wants to go on the field, analyzing, the idea of subjectivity formation. What about the researcher? Does the researcher has to be mobile, like the tourist, or immobile? And especially when it comes to, you mentioned the pandemic. I was very happy to read about the pandemic. The idea that you say the pandemic did not stop subjectivity formation. So it's interesting again, the dichotomy mobile, immobile. So for a while, we all became immobile though, right, with the pandemic. So we got virtual tourism, domestic tourism, which became big. So I would like to know, some suggestion for researchers who want to analyze these topics on the field. Thank you so much.
Who would go after that? If you want to ask a question.
Yes, hello.
Sorry, Max, let's see. First, if Ilya or Mira have a question. If they don't, then I will pass it on to Dominic first to answer, and then we'll return to you. Yeah?
I have already a short question. It is how is the difference between Anglo-Saxon way of understanding the territory and the French one? Dominic has stressed this in several parts of his text and the arguments, and it is very interesting concept for me. I really like it. He can expand.
Okay. Okay. Who would like to go after that?
I think Ilya has her hand up, and then I can go afterwards.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, Ilya can go next. No? Well, Vera, perhaps you can ask, and when Ilya gets back.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm a PhD student at UQAM, and I work with Dominic, so I'm kind of close to these ideas, but I was just, I sort of got stuck on the idea of the tourist and perhaps the tourism territory as post-political, and I'm wondering about the political potential that maybe is provided when we think through territorialization, deterritorialization, or not. And I wonder how we can think about the political potential. And it also makes me think of maybe to rebound on the question that was posed about the researcher, that if the political potential is to sort of de-identify with tourism or to de-touristify, is that good enough? And the example I'm thinking of is that I was interested in talking with tourism workers, and I was told by people that I would perceive as tourism workers that, well, I'm not a tourism worker, so I can't talk to you. I'm a community worker, or I serve my community, I don't serve tourists. So I just wonder if there's more political potential beyond just de-identifying with tourism.
Excellent. Yeah, that's a very good question. Not to mention nationalism. I come from the Sangam era, and it was at the tip of my tongue how tourism and national identity come together. But anyway, let's take Ilya's as well, and then I think we'll pass it on to Dominic, and then we get more questions from the crowd. Okay? I can't hear you. You are muted, Ilya, and I don't know why.
Ilya, can you send us the question through writing while I start to answer, and then I will close that section.
I think if you can write it down, then Dominic can answer. Yeah. So Dominic, if you could answer these particular questions, maybe.
Yeah, I'll start with Maximiliano questions. Yes, indeed. In the paper I wrote about this this idea of territoire and territories, it's mostly within the geographical discipline. So I know that, you know, in common language they are quite close one to another, but there's a strong in the Anglo-Saxon geography, territory have a strong tradition of being associated with geopolitics, where in the French geography, which I know is much smaller in scope than the Anglo-Saxon geography, that's for sure, but you have that particular angle, which is somewhere, you know, that it's closer to place, but then that is, you know, where place is mostly, you know, is really socially product, you know, way of life somewhere, and identities and everything. Where in the French, that also you have that level of politics and of you know, le territoire in French is much more institutionalized than place, but not as structural as territory in the geopolitical sense. So, but I know if we enlarge the scope, the difference between territoire and territories, it might not be as marked of what I'm exposing there. But in the dominant geography discourses, that's quite, I would say, the main difference with both. But either in the French geography and in the Anglo-Saxon geography, at the margin, you know, they recoup each other. So that's for the first one. Where I position myself on the continuum with migrants and tourists, and I think, you know, the question of migrants is not something I address directly, but it definitely something that we can't escape when we think of when we bring tourism within the larger mobility paradigm. And your point were really interesting in the fact that how, you know, like migrants worker with their precarity, all of a sudden, you know, they get engulfed in, as a, I would say in some way, as a deterritorialized subject, you know, within that deterritorializing global tourism industry, you know, and bringing it within that strong capitalistic accumulation system. And this biopolitical, and this is highly biopolitical in the sense that they create a hierarchy of people, and that is brought with laws and discourses and practices that make those hierarchy being internalized by the actual, you know, people that are living through it. And that's something that we also, I think is, and Myra was bringing it, I know it's something that is part of our discussion a lot, is how the tourism workers all of a sudden get, you know, embedded, or say weave into all kind of practices, but also of discursive subjectivity formation that actually normalize their precarity as something that is some kind of desirable. And I would, you know, I don't want to make too much publicity on Myra's work, but in her master thesis, she really underlined that thing, that people were doing the same job. For some, it was some kind of an alienation, and for some, it was a lifestyle choice, you know, of being within that entertainment, cultural, striving, encountery tourism industry. And I think that can be also, you know, there's something there. See how those discourses and practices do they work, and are they brought within that, I would say, really with high precarity migrant workers within tourism. I think that there's something there. In terms of the post-political potential, and I would go on one of the questions in the chat about the destination, and for me, I've been working, and in one of the paper that is coming out in the next, I don't know how many months, but there's that thing where I think destination is a misleading concept, and it's a really neoliberal concept that that try to bring space of tourism, especially through marketing, to be something that is really, much more well-defined and that can be managed and sold. And I think that kind of hide a lot of the social and political process at play and all the contests, the contested practices that are within tourism, but also at the frontier of tourism that are not as clear-cut as destination. And that's why destinations are so, they are at so many scales. And I don't think those scales have the same rule of territorialization, deterritorialization, and they are not, internalizing for their stakeholders the biopolitical control, I would say, mind frame or process or practices that you are at a micro level destination in a rural community or a global destination of a world city region, So that would be my answers in terms of the different questions.
It's a shame that you didn't attend the first seminar because there we had a discussion about how people in localities are stuck with tourism, and they become, they internalize this idea that, you enter the paradise, basically. And they become, as Ilya's question is very pertinent here, because he says that sometimes local people become objects of consumption.
Yeah, and I think for me, that reflection is totally include that the fact that people, local people in their daily life are consumed, and I wouldn't even say metaphorically, they are really consumed, but they are indirectly consumed. And that's something that we have to bring into when we go back to thinking of capitalism and tourism. There's one thing, the famous point of realization, where all of a sudden something become a commodity, and that's where we have something in tourism that is quite particular, is the fact that the point of realization are not what the tourists in the end consume, because it consumed the experience, it consumed the place. And so it's not because the local, and I would say the resident people in their daily life are not consumed directly, that they are not consumed. It's indirectly, but still, and that's where the biopolitical process of tourism territories become kind of, I would say subversive, but I'm not sure it's the right word in English, but, it's kind of become it's become inherent to the actual discourse and practices, because, and in the work that I've done with my colleague Hélène Bélanger, where we're looking at the touristification of daily life through gentrification, actually that's what we were looking at. And all of a sudden, it's little step by little step. We know with discourses that at the basic, the local and resident would be, it would not be against, would end up actually kind of killing their own way of life, So at the beginning, no one is against having less crime in where they live. No one is against having better services. But all of a sudden, the market and the speculation bring it in, and then you sell a way of life where the actual people who created it are pushed outside, and that's, that's where you have a biopolitical. You have, different biopolitical processes that territorialize, deterritorialize, and reterritorialize living in place, but also moving in place and consuming this place.
Excellent. Abhishek is with his hand raised for a while. And he did post the comment.
I just typed my question. I thought we are a bit rushed or something.
I'm sorry, Alex. Go ahead.
Oh, so I really thank you for this wonderful presentation. So my question is really brief, and it's kind of a gloss over to Myra's question. I was wondering that much has changed in the tourism industry since, you know, Yuri's formulation of consuming places, with which you start off your paper that Rodanti circulated among us. So I was just wondering if the new practices of tourism, like considered the people who volunteer for organic farming, people who are a part of non-transactional hospitality network and digital nomads and so on and so forth. Let's say conscious tourists, so to say. I mean, do they perform tourism any differently? Like I myself have in my work posited the vagabond as the nemesis of the tourist, as in like the mobile subject with a political intent, as opposed to what you call like the depoliticized or the post-political tourists. So I was just wondering if these new formats and the new genres of tourism would have anything to differ with the kind of imagination of territories that you talked about. Yeah, thank you.
Abhishek, you could post also the title of your book because I think it's very relevant. So post it on the chat line. But I think also Desmond has been waiting for a while to ask a question, and I think it's time to see if you would like. Yes.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
I wanted to say thank you very much, Dominic, for a very nice presentation. As you were speaking about this territoire, I mean the French version of it, I got distracted, and I was thinking of terroir, and you know, I started thinking about, you know, this idea of landscaping, of environments, of environmental conditions for the production of things in a specific space. And so if you really think if you go back to the rhizome, I was thinking then, wait a minute, if we actually applied that to the terroir instead of territoire, then how do we understand perhaps the making of the grape? You know, the grape could be in a way the local, which became then the wine, right? So for me, this was quite an interesting kind of parallel to what you're talking about. And I'm just wondering then, the question then is, if this is somewhat related because the origins of terroir also comes from terra, then how do we, you know, did you maybe explore the possibilities of working also with this sense of place as going back to the landscape, because you alluded to that in your pictures on the waterfront. Yeah. I'm just wondering if on the waterfront we could also see grapes as well. So this is my question to you.
Do you want me to go for the two?
Can I ask if Richard and Manuel have any questions as well? Or comments?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
We should start.
You go ahead, please.
Okay, Richard.
Okay. I try to be short here. As I understand you, Dominic, I really like the presentation, by the way. It's very rich. And also, as you hinted, you're about to kind of unpack your thinking here in different directions. And if we take terroir in French geography, particularly if we go to Raffestein,
yeah,
it's not only about the institutionalization of the everyday life and demarcation and so on. It also, a crucial aspect here is being. So it is influenced by Heidegger. And as I understand it, when I hear you, you have kind of two tracks here. but perhaps I could check if you kind of agree with me. One is the more kind of looking at the material landscape, how it is deterritorialized, and so on, trying to apply Deleuze and Guattari in well, the kind of philosophical, in social science context. But what also kind of opens up here, what you discussed about the touristification of the everyday life, and that is kind of, in a way, at least in a Eurocentric perspective, tourism is a particular way to relate to the world that becomes kind of encapsulated in capitalist practices and so on. So it kind of relates to the existence. I mean, how we exist by relate to the world. And so I see that kind of coming out in the French concept of territoire, two quite disparate directions, if you like. One more abstract towards reaching the kind of ontological violence of the world picture eventually, possibly, and the other one being more kind of the material conditions for the subjectivities of peoples and places. But is that something that you have been thinking about, or is it another way to cut this? Because I try to kind of see how that could be combined, the more kind of philosophical, ontological avenue and the more kind of material, empirical avenue, because they are related in perhaps in how we relate to the world as humans, and not even tourist humans. I see it's kind of a. Have you thought anything about that when you're writing the other? I mean, you have other papers going on, so we didn't see the whole picture today.
Manuel?
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I just want to add some color to this. Your presentation and your paper was very interesting, and you were talking about tourism territorializing and deterritorializing, how tourism contributes to the formation of subjectivity. Richard comes from Sweden, I come from the Canary Islands, and first time I attended a conference hosted by Rodanti, I was in San Agustin, which is a place where we have New Sweden. It's in summer, it's Canary Island people going there on holidays. In wintertime, it's Swedish completely. So I'm 48 now. 2 weeks ago, I have been quite busy because my father has developed dementia, so we have been clearing his house, and his house is in a place full of tourism. So I really felt so appealed by what you say, that some people think tourism places, so to speak, have no meaning. Well, they may have no meaning to you. They have to me. I know many Swedish people come to the Canary Islands and it's their beach holiday spot. So they have memories associated with it. And it's interesting because the idea of territory may be different. You may go, we may go to the same place, even though for me it's a 50-kilometer trip, and for people from Sweden it's like 5,000-kilometer trip. So it's not really a question, it's just, I would say, not even a comment, just to add some color on what you have just been talking about. Thank you for the presentation, which, by the way, maybe academic standards are not so high lately, but I found it very nice. Thank you.
It's more than that, actually, Manuel, because it does connect the question of personal and family memories to biopolitics, potentially. It was a very good question. Dominic, to you.
Yeah. First of all, I would start with Richard comments, questions, and you really, but well, you know, you're part of my regular citation list, so your work is inspirational for me, and I think you really pinpoint that I would say, that dialectics that is kind of fueling my, that I cannot yet find a satisfactory answer, because you have like that, indeed, like that territoire living in place, that is territoire and terroir are close. And on that side, I'm also like reading a lot about Anna Tsing and the Holocene entanglement that are disentangling right now. And I don't want to open into that, but when you think about territoire and then terroir, you at one point you get there, because that is what is also materially transforming. But then that idea of being in the world, indeed, because we're as critical as we are of tourism, and that's another personal contradiction I think that a lot of us share. As critical as we are of tourism, well, we kind of like to travel, and there's part of that way of being in the world that we embrace fully. And I know that Kelly Catton, who would like be your next speaker, I think in that series of seminar in May, is totally within that perspective too. So how can we bridge that contradiction, and there's, when you go in place and you have the material condition of life, and right now we see, we tried to start a project between Mexico and Canada about cottage culture. Because all of a sudden we have Canadians buying piece of land around lakes in central Mexico to create a cottage culture, an hybrid cottage culture from the north and the south, intermingle with post-colonial perspective. And that's like, and then you look at that and you see people materially push out of their way of life and everything. And then that's shocking. And then you end up thinking about how deterritorialized practice have really territorial impact. But then there's that way of being and that cosmopolitan ideals that we've been, that is, kind of cracking. Yeah, the mushroom at the end of time. It's a must read.
Dominic is into mushrooms. Beware.
Yeah. So I'm not, and that's what kept me writing lately. In the pandemics, I didn't get the chance to do as much field work as I like to, as Canada was under high mobility restriction domestically. We had a 4-month curfew. So when you get home at 8 and you cannot travel through different regions, and you go back to philosophy, I think, as a scholar to write. And that, I cannot seem to find a satisfactory bridging of this, and that's why I'm keeping writing those those kind of presentation. That's for that part. As for the non-transactional hospitality network, the tourism volunteering, they are indeed, I would say, politically. Valent in some ways, but one of my questions that I have with those practices, it's how those mobile, I would say, tourism subject that are trying to go beyond tourism, and bring their leisure mobility within a different framework or frame of actions, actually are perceived by the hosting communities. And I know that Gada Marous of Concordia did some work on, volunteering, where actually those volunteers didn't see themselves as tourists, but, they were doing international, humanitarian, I think it was in the humanitarian development paradigm, but the local, we're seeing them as tourists. And they were constructing them as tourists. So that interplay again needs to be considered, because if the local consider them as tourists, they might depoliticize them, or they kind of instrumentalize their political agenda for a different political agenda, which is raising all kind of good question. And as Desmond, I talk about the terroir and the entanglements, and I think, and it's definitely an important avenue of looking at tourism research. And then I'll close, because well, if there's other question, I can keep going, but I see time's flying, and probably some of you have different activities to do.
5 minutes.
Okay, so but I didn't answer the for the researchers, you know, for the students, for the people on the field. I think that this theoretical, you know, apparatus, when we come back to the first, you know, I would say the 3 first questions. So what actually the tourists consume, you know, what, you know, the tourist industry, well, the tourist, you know, assemblage is proposing to the mobile subjects, and what are the string of powers who are making it then, you know, stick together is part of the questions, you know, that we can bring to the field, and it can be answered with all kind of data. It's with Myra, right at the beginning of the pandemic, we end up we did a quick project that they were not done analyzing because there were so much materials, but we looked for the 6 first week past the World Health Organization call for pandemic states at numbers of international English language newspapers and at their articles. And right now, the first part of where there were tourism, mobility, and pandemic, you know, and COVID. And we had like thousands of newspapers, articles. And one of the line of analysis that I have done that I'll present a little bit at the Japan, the CTR, I would say, a seminar that is happening right now, but that I will present in much more details in the Nordic Geographer meeting in June, is who's talking? You know, when the journalists quote and make other, you know, bring people words in the paper, who they are talking, you know, who's talking. And that's something interesting that we, you know, we see officials, government bodies, we see a lot of medical experts, but then we have tourists talking about what they live. But tourism workers are very, very few, you know, because, you know, there's all that construction of the tourism worker being in the backstage. You know, and they are, you know, where there's just a little part in context and everything else, it's in the back. And we have that slick, I would say, non-striated, smooth space of tourism where, you know, you go in your experience, but then you get all that backstage that we don't see. And in the newspaper, in those discourses, that backstage is not there. And that's quite interesting to see how we have many tourism speaking, and I'm not even analyzing yet what they are saying, but just the fact that we give, you know, and those newspapers are not neutral, and I'm not saying they are representative of, but they are representative of a main discursive practices that shape thoughts, that shape policies, and that shape, you know, priorities. And so the experience of you know, of feeling threatened or feeling safe of tourists within that very particular moment in time and history versus the workers, you know, are such an equal, you know, and then that asks questions about why and how, and so, you know, we can bring those line of inquiries with actual quite easily, you know, traceable, findable, and workable data. But of course, the deeper you go in detail, in observation, how people interact in space, how they recreate space, how they challenge space, how they biopolitically internalize code of conduct in space within the space of encounters, also how politically destination, like I says, that I personally think it's a misleading concept, but we could debate on that into another seminar, are shaping what can be done where and who can do what where within laws, within signs, and all this can, you know, can be brought into that line to kind of understanding how we create that possibility of between, you know, being in the world, like Richard said, and the actual landscape, the condition of life, but also how we can institutionalize a mobility into that is grasped by capitalism. So many questions.
Excellent. Though, I mean, very good questions. I don't see anyone raising their hand. I am going to conclude by asking a very quick one, because we are running out of time. We have only 2 minutes. I have a zillion, actually, because we share in interest, but just to concentrate on concepts. One thing that is left out is the idea and the notion of land as basically as well as what appears as patrida or patria or fatherland in a lot of discourses, especially in nationalism, but not only, because it follows on from this when we explore heritage tourism, and there, of course, the concept of patrimonio appears. And I think there is a direct connection to biopolitics there. Does it figure anywhere in the kind of research that you're doing in these small communities? Because we say capitalism, you know, it kind of deterritorializes, but reterritorialize and things can get equally bad, if not worse, by kind of promoting this kind of very isolated, inward-looking image, you know, our land, you know, where we come from, memory, resentment, and so on and so forth. So what do you think about it?
That's a very good question, and that's where that's where also for a lot of I would say you know, especially in the geopolitical geography, the idea of and even in one of our you know, beginning of 2000 texts, David Harvey look at territory as the, you know, the locus of the inward looking, the us against them, and also the, you know, the and the self, you know, the clothing on itself place, you know, instead of space. And I don't want to reopen that huge debate between space and place that Harvey and Massey had, but the idea, and that's the thing, you know, in the French language, terroir and territoire have that land, you know, more ingrained into it, that I would say place. And in my research, like I said, most of my research are looking at very small scale rural area, but I have to negotiate with a higher scale process, you know, that are imposed on them or that they choose to try to get into it, and tourism is one of them. And for me, there's two things in the what you bring about the idea of land, and tourism is quite of once again kind of a contradiction within that, because on one side is an affirmation of how we live in some place, you know, because that's where in the market we differentiate and we can sell it higher within the new hierarchy that is created in terms of attractivity by tourism. But at the same time, it become a normalizing forces. So because, you know, when all of a sudden tourism become an industry that will just try to reproduce itself, and that account only for night stays and expenses, all of a sudden the tourism, you know, how the self of the tourists preconceive the other of you know, land and culture as land or nationalism is defined, and then they might, you know, there's the temptation to just offer it to them. You know, and so you have that contradiction at some point between a normalizing and also, I would say, a differentiating process. So then then you get that negotiation of alterity into that. But then on the other side, the other thing is that I think it's really, especially and surprisingly, especially in the Western world, it's the land tenure regime as a social political institution ingrained within capitalism. And we have a lot of studies about land tenure regime in the South coming from the North, you know, in terms of, you know, in geography and in development studies. But we have a kind of an assumptions that our land tenure regime in the North is so institutionalized that is mostly, and neoliberalism brought that too, that is mostly, you know, a neutral institution to manage land and how we sell it and how we use it, but it's not neutral at all. And it have lots of, and in one of our research on climate change, we end up looking at how the land tenure regime actually in Canada keep private property all the time in the market, even if you're not planning on selling it, because that's how you tax it. That's how you get money from it to rebuild. But then in all the research we were looking at, that land tenure regime was either not mentioned or seen as, you know, a management tool that is neutral. You know, and for me, that's a blind spot that we have in a lot of research in geography and regional development in the North in general, but in tourism even more, how those different symbolic layers that tourism bring to land are counted or not within the land tenure regime as a social institution, again, not as a management tool. There's a whole field of research there that I won't tap into in the next few years, but I think for new scholars or someone you know want to make a little turn in their research, there's a huge blind spot there.
Thank you very much,
You're welcome.
Dominic. It was a really interesting presentation, and the contributions from all the people who asked questions and our discussions were also excellent. I hope I'll see you in the third and the last session that we will have in May, hopefully, if you can make it. But now I will conclude the session, stop the recording as well,